They thought it was just a shortcut through a ghost town, but they drove straight into a place where something old was waiting to take over. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. Tonight, we're talking about a road trip that went sideways, deep in the forgotten stretch of Highway 80. It's the kind of place GPS won't even track. And if you take that turn, you might end up in a town that never officially died. It just got claimed. The two friends in this story, Mark and Chloe, were just looking for cheap gas and a quick way home. They found a town named Meridian, and they found out that sometimes the things that possess you aren't just ghosts. They're worse. Mark and Chloe had been driving for 8 hours when they saw the sign, Meridian next exit. Mark was driving, feeling that heavy fatigue that sets in just after midnight. Chloe was asleep, head against the window. The gas light had been blinking for the last 20 miles. Meridian wasn't on the map, but the sign looked official enough. They took the exit, hoping for one of those tiny, independently owned stations that still sold gas for $3 less than the national chains. The road they were on quickly changed from smooth asphalt to cracked, uneven concrete. It felt wrong. The air outside the car suddenly got heavy, thick with the smell of old dirt and something that smelled like burnt electrical wiring. It was a cold smell, even though it was the middle of summer. Mark noticed the noise changed, too. The hum of the tires on the highway was replaced by a dead quiet, broken only by the engine's constant drone. They drove a mile and saw the town, Meridian. It wasn't completely dark. A few streetlights were glowing, but they were a weird, sickly orange color, flickering slowly. All the buildings looked like they had been abandoned in a hurry. Storefront windows were boarded up, paint peeling off in long, curled strips. Cars old, 1950s models, sat parked on the curb, covered in dust so thick it looked like gray velvet. Mark slowed down. This wasn't just closed. This felt like a movie set for an apocalypse. Chloe woke up and sat bolt upright. She rubbed her eyes and looked out. Where are we? This isn't right, Mark. Turn around. Mark agreed, but turning around felt like a bad idea. The street they were on was narrow, and the buildings pressed in too close. He wanted to get to the end of the main street, find a side road, and leave. He drove past a diner, the Comet, where the counter was still lined with stools. The mugs were still on the hooks, but everything was coated in that heavy gray dust. Then he saw it. In the middle of the street, sitting perfectly upright, was a bicycle, a child's red tricycle. It looked clean, not dusty like everything else. As they passed it, Chloe gasped. She pressed her hand against the dashboard. "Mark, did you see that?" she whispered. Mark had been looking at the tricycle in the rearview mirror, trying to figure out why it was so clean. "Yeah, it's just a tricycle." "No," Chloe said, her voice shaking now. "There was someone on it, a kid." Just for a second, right there. Mark looked again. Nothing. Just the tricycle and the dead town stretching out behind them. He drove faster. The gas needle was practically on empty now. Then they saw a car on the side of the road, a late-model sedan, not one of the dusty antiques. It had Indiana plates, not local ones. The doors were open, hanging loose. They saw the interior lights were still on. Mark pulled up slowly. Maybe they could ask for help, or maybe take some gas. As he stopped, the air grew even colder. The cold didn't come from the car's AC. It felt like it was coming up from the ground, through the floorboards. Chloe suddenly reached over and locked her door. "Don't get out, Mark. Just drive." Mark didn't listen. He felt a weird, pressing curiosity. He grabbed his small flashlight and stepped out onto the strange, dusty street. The car next to theirs was silent. No keys in the ignition, no phone, nothing. But on the back seat, half covered by a travel blanket, was a worn paperback book. It was face down, its spine cracked. He picked it up. It was a book of regional folklore, and the bookmark was resting on a chapter titled Meridian's Whispering Clay. He was about to call Chloe to come look, but a sound caught his attention. It was a dragging sound, like heavy cloth being pulled over gravel. It came from the open door of the old drugstore across the street. Mark shined his light into the dark opening. Nothing. The sound stopped. He took a nervous step back towards his car. Then the dragging sound came again, closer this time and faster. It was right behind the drugstore counter. Mark lifted the flashlight higher, aiming it through the shattered plate glass window. He saw the counter, the shelves, and then he saw the dust move. It didn't lift into the air. It flowed off the counter, down the cabinets, and onto the floor, gathering into a pile, almost like gray water. He turned and bolted toward the car. As he reached the driver's side, he could feel the pressure on his chest, heavy and cold. He slid in, slamming the door and locking it instantly. "Go." "Drive," Chloe screamed. Mark put the car in drive and hit the gas, the engine roaring a pathetic protest. As they sped up, Chloe was looking back. "Mark, look at your shadow." He glanced down. In the pale glow of the flickering orange streetlights, his own shadow seemed stretched, long, and distorted. It wasn't just dark. It was moving with a strange, unnatural wobble, detached from his own body's motion. The shadow didn't look like him anymore. It looked thin and impossibly tall. They made it to the edge of town, where a dilapidated, half-rotten wooden gate marked the highway return. Mark slammed the accelerator, and the car sped out onto the dark, familiar highway. The cold lifted, and the smell of hot asphalt and pine trees returned. They were safe. Mark pulled over about 10 miles later, his hand shaking badly. Chloe was crying silently. "We need to call the police," she managed to choke out. Mark nodded, but then he reached up to rub his tired eyes, and that's when he noticed the difference. His hands, they were stiff. His fingers were too long. He looked at his reflection in the phone screen. His eyes weren't tired. They were too wide, with a sharp, unfriendly gleam in them. His expression was tight, unfamiliar. He looked like himself, but like a wax figure of himself that someone had slightly altered. Chloe looked at him and stopped crying. Her eyes widened with genuine, raw terror. "Mark... what did you bring with you?" she whispered. Mark tried to answer, but when he opened his mouth, the voice that came out was deep and slow, like stones grinding together, and it wasn't his voice at all. "We have returned," the voice said, through Mark's mouth. Chloe scrambled back against the passenger door, reaching for the handle. The Mark she knew was gone. The thing that was using his body just smiled a slow, terrible stretch of his lips that showed too much gum. He reached a hand out, and even though Mark's body was driving the car, the arms seemed to move independently, like a snake. The entity possessing Mark's body didn't need to look at the road. It didn't seem to need to breathe. It just drove, eyes fixed on Chloe. It spoke again, the low, rasping voice confirming the horror. It explained that Meridian wasn't abandoned. The people were simply taken. Their bodies remained, empty and still, but their forms were now available for the things that lived in the clay under the town. The dragging Mark had heard was the dust settling, the old forms stretching out, looking for new skin. Chloe was trapped. She realized Mark hadn't just picked up a dusty book. Something had attached itself when he stood outside that empty car. Mark's body slowed the car down. He or the thing in him reached across and took the keys out of the ignition. "We need the rest of your form," the voice hissed. Two vessels are always stronger. Chloe had one chance. She didn't fight the thing's hand. She didn't try to wrestle the keys away. Instead, she kicked the dashboard as hard as she could, directly into the old, worn radio knob. The radio came on with a sudden burst of static and a screeching, high-pitched religious sermon. The effect was instant. Mark's body jerked violently, as if hit by an electrical current. The terrible smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, agonized hatred. The entity was clearly sensitive to the sound. Chloe knew the ancient things had their weaknesses, and maybe this modern, sharp sound was enough. She took the chance. She lunged for the door handle, flung herself out of the car, and hit the shoulder of the road, tumbling into the gravel. The engine of the car started again instantly. Mark's possessed body was sitting up, staring out at her, but the noise of the radio was still blasting, and the entity seemed unable to drive and fight the sound at the same time. Chloe didn't wait. She got up, ignoring the stinging pain of the gravel cuts, and ran. She ran back towards the dark, abandoned highway. She could hear the car door open behind her, and the sound of Mark's heavy, familiar work boots hitting the pavement. Only now, the footsteps sounded too fast, too heavy, and the breathing that followed wasn't human. She ran until she couldn't breathe, finally collapsing behind a thick cluster of highway signage, sobbing. She stayed there, huddled in the shadow of a sign for 3 hours, listening. The sounds of the highway came back, the rush of 18-wheelers, the distant, normal world. The entity eventually gave up. She didn't hear the footsteps return, but she heard the car start and drive away. It took her until sunrise to flag down a truck driver who was willing to stop. She told him she had been in a wreck, told him she needed to call the police. She was taken to the hospital, treated for minor injuries, and questioned. The police found the abandoned car, Mark's rental, about 50 miles away from where she had jumped out. It was completely empty. No keys, no possessions, and no Mark. The police classified it as a missing person case, maybe a simple abandonment. Chloe didn't tell them about Meridian, or the whispering clay, or the stolen body. She knew they would lock her up. She knew the truth. Mark was gone. The thing that drove the car away was still out there, using his face, driving his body, looking for another form to bring back to the dead town. The road trip ended, but the possession didn't. Chloe spent the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, knowing that somewhere the entity was driving around in Mark's skin, waiting for the right moment and the right isolated place to claim its second vessel. The lesson is simple. Don't take the shortcuts, and never stop for help in a town that looks too quiet. You never know who or what is waiting to invite itself in. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. If you felt that shiver, hit the like button and subscribe for more Black Hour stories. He worked the graveyard shift in the graveyard itself, and one night, the dead stopped staying where they were put. Welcome to the Black Hour stories. Tonight we're digging into the worst kind of place to be alone after dark, a huge, old cemetery. The story focuses on a man named Arthur. Arthur was the main night custodian and groundskeeper at Sunnyvale Memorial, a place with thousands of cold stones and decades of history. He thought he knew everything about the graveyard shift, the quiet, the darkness, the routine. But one night, that routine cracked open, and Arthur saw the impossible, a hidden door between the soil and the surface. Arthur worked the late shift because the pay was better and he liked the quiet. He drove the small, golf cart-sized utility vehicle around the winding paths, checking the locks on the maintenance sheds, making sure no teenagers had hopped the fence. Sunnyvale was mostly peaceful. The dead stayed dead. One cold Tuesday in November, Arthur was performing his last loop around the new section, Section L. It was near the back fence, next to a small, deep ravine that bordered the city property. The ground here was uneven and covered in new sod that hadn't quite taken hold yet. He slowed down near a fresh grave, one they had just filled the day before for an older woman named Mrs. Peterson. As he drove past, he saw something shiny lying on the mound of dirt. It was too late for a visitor. He stopped the cart and walked over, his heavy flashlight cutting a beam through the deep mist rolling in from the ravine. It was a silver earring, dropped by one of the mourners. He bent down to pick it up, and that's when the air got strange. It didn't get cold, but it got heavy, almost rubbery, like walking through thick honey. Then he heard a sound coming from the mound under his feet. It wasn't a settling sound. It was a tapping, rhythmic and hollow, coming from somewhere deep inside the packed soil. Arthur froze. He told himself it was just trapped air. Sometimes gas pockets or soil shifting could make strange noises, but this tapping didn't sound random. It sounded like someone rapping on wood. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. He stepped back quickly. The fog was getting thick now, swallowing the nearest headstones. He knew he should leave, but his job was to report anything unusual. And a tapping sound from a grave a few hours old was definitely unusual. He waited for a minute, flashlight aimed at the dark earth. The tapping stopped. He breathed a sigh of relief, just settling. He took a step away, but then he heard something else. A faint scratching, like fingernails dragging across rough concrete, getting louder. And then a low, wet sound, like someone trying to breathe through a handful of mud. Arthur started running back to his cart, adrenaline flooding his system. He threw himself into the seat and fumbled for the key. As he turned it, he glanced back one last time at Mrs. Peterson's grave. The entire mound of earth was moving, not settling slowly, but pulsing a slow, sickly heave. And from the center, the loose, dark dirt was beginning to separate, pushing outward from a single point. Something pale and glistening was slowly pushing its way up through the soil. He got the cart started and sped down the path, not caring about the speed bumps. He kept looking in the side mirror, watching the horror unfold behind him. He saw a shape rise up from the dirt, not a full body, but a piece of it. A thin, bony arm, covered in dark, clinging soil, reaching up into the cold air. The hand was clenched, fingers grasping at nothing. Arthur didn't stop until he was safely inside the security office, slamming and locking the thick steel door. He sat there, shaking, breathing hard. He decided he had seen a wild animal, maybe a fox, burrowing. But the arm, he knew what he had seen. It was too long, too pale, too much like a human reaching out from its prison. He didn't call the police. He didn't want to explain how a recently deceased person's arm was sticking out of the ground. He waited until dawn, until the first sunlight hit the glass of the office window. When the sun was fully up, Arthur drove back out to Section L. The grave looked perfectly normal. The mound of dirt was smooth, undisturbed. The earring he had dropped was gone. He searched the area for any sign of digging, any misplaced dirt, anything. Nothing. The ground was cold and silent. He went home that morning, sick to his stomach. He tried to tell his wife he was ill, but he knew he was just terrified. He slept all day, trying to shake the image of the reaching hand. He returned for his shift that night, forcing himself to believe it was a hallucination caused by lack of sleep. But the moment he drove through the cemetery gates, the heavy, rubbery air returned, pressing down on the car. He drove straight to Section L. He didn't see anything unusual, but he noticed a small detail near Mrs. Peterson's headstone. A set of three-toed tracks were pressed lightly into the dew-covered sod near the stone. They didn't look like any animal he knew. They looked like a heavy bird had walked there, but the prints were too deep and too wide. He got out his flashlight and followed the tracks. They led directly away from the grave, across the path, and stopped at the base of a very old oak tree near the ravine. Arthur shined the light up the trunk. Nothing. But the tapping started again. This time it wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from inside the oak tree. Tap, 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 like a beak or a knuckle hitting dry wood. He stepped back, ready to run, but a voice stopped him. It wasn't loud, and it didn't sound ghostly. It was a dry, raspy whisper, like dead leaves skittering across the pavement. "You saw us." The words weren't directed at him, but at the general air around the grave. Arthur looked around frantically. The fog was rolling in again, thick and white. He realized the tracks were the key. Whatever had reached out from the grave had climbed out, walked on those three-toed feet, and was now hiding. It wasn't the dead that were escaping. It was something else wearing the dead. Suddenly, a massive shape dropped from the branches of the oak tree. It wasn't human. It was tall and bent, covered in patches of grayish skin and dark, clinging earth. It walked on those three-toed feet and carried an impossible weight. Its head was small, tucked down into a neck that didn't look right, but its eyes glowed faintly, a dull, yellowish color. And in its long, bony hands it was carrying the silver earring. It looked at Arthur. Then the thing opened its mouth, and that wet, struggling sound came out, but this time it formed words. "We need to cover the open place." Arthur finally understood. By seeing the hand and coming back, he had alerted this thing, this caretaker of the earth, that the grave was imperfect, that the seal had been broken. He didn't run this time. He just stood there, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of the creature. The entity took a heavy, slow step towards the grave, then another. Arthur watched as the thing, moving with agonizing slowness, stepped directly onto Mrs. Peterson's grave mound. It shifted its weight, pressing the soil down with its strange feet. As it pressed the dirt, the thing looked back at Arthur one last time. It raised the arm that held the silver earring and brought its long, impossibly sharp fingernails to its mouth. It scraped the nail across its own teeth, making a sound like metal on glass. It was warning him. The heavy, cold feeling on the air vanished, replaced by a terrible silence. The thing sank slowly into the mound of dirt, pressing the earth down with its unnatural weight until it was completely gone. The only proof it had ever been there was the silver earring, now lying on the center of the grave, glittering faintly in the dark. Arthur quit that night. He left the keys to the utility card on the desk with a note that just read, "It's not safe to look." He never went back to Sunnyvale. He moved out of the state a month later. But for the rest of his life, whenever he walked near fresh dirt or heard a sudden rhythmic tapping, he remembered the thing that rose from the grave to put the earth back in its place. He realized he hadn't seen a ghost. He had seen a sentinel, a creature that guarded the boundaries of the world, making sure the dead didn't get out and that no one saw what it took to keep them in. The true terror wasn't in the dead rising, but in the watcher who made sure they didn't. Arthur saw behind the curtain, saw the mechanism that keeps the earth sealed, and he paid the price with his peace of mind. Some secrets are best left buried. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. If you felt that shiver, hit the like button and subscribe for more Black Hour stories.